When you sit down at your desk and stare at the specs sheet for a high-end audio interface, it's easy to feel a little lost. You're asking yourself, will this actually make my mixes sound better, or am I just paying for a shiny badge? I've been in that spot more times than I'd like to admit, and the Apollo x16 Gen 2 is one of those pieces of gear that keeps popping up in conversation because it promises a lot next-generation conversion, analog model preamps, and a full library of UAD plugins. The question is whether it lives up to the hype in everyday use, and whether it's the right fit for you or a costly misstep. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First, let's talk about what you actually do with a desktop audio interface in a typical home studio workflow. Most of us record vocals, guitars, synths, maybe some drum programming, then we spend hours mixing, balancing levels, tweaking tones, and finally bouncing out a stereo master. The Apollo line promises that every step of that process will be smoother because of its built-in DSP processing and unison preamps that emulate classic analog gear. In practice, the biggest tangible benefit I've seen is the ability to run UAD plugins in real time without taxing your computer's CPU. That means you can put a classic Neve preamp emulator on a vocal track, a Fairchild compressor on the drum bus, and a Lexicon reverb on the synths, all before the signal even hits your DAW. For someone who wants the vintage vibe without the rack of hardware, that can be a real time saver. Who should consider the X16? If you're already recording at a professional or semi-professional level, think 24-track sessions, a mix that needs fine-grained EQ work, or a client who expects a polished sound, this interface gives you a toolbox that traditionally required a separate DSP box or a pricey analog console. The 8 analog inputs with unison capability are great for mice-intensive sessions. If you're a composer who relies heavily on virtual instruments and wants to route complex sidechains without choking your CPU, the 16-bit A192 kHz conversion paired with the built-in UAD plugins will make real-time monitoring feel buttery smooth. In short, the Apollo X16 is built for a workstation that already has a solid DAW setup and a modest amount of processing headroom. On the flip side, if you're a bedroom hobbyist who mostly records a single vocal or acoustic guitar and does most of your processing in the DAW after the fact, you might not see enough of a return on investment. The device's price point reflects its extensive feature set, and many of those features like the full library of 200+ UAD plugins will sit idle if you never plan to use them. Also, the device relies on a Thunderbolt 3 connection. If your computer only has USB-C without Thunderbolt, you either need an adapter or a different interface. That extra step can be a stumbling block for those who aren't comfortable adding another link in the chain. Now let's look at the practical strengths that matter after you unpack the box. The next-generation audio conversion with the widest dynamic range claim translates into a surprisingly clean capture of low-end frequencies. I ran a test recording a kick drum through a pair of Shure SM57S. And even the subsonic rumble that usually masks under the main thump came through with clarity. That level of detail becomes useful when you're trying to sculpt a bass line or manage the low end of a full mix. The bass management feature adds a dedicated subwoofer output, which is a blessing for those mixing in a room with a subwoofer or who want to ensure their low-frequency content translates to larger playback systems. The unison preamp emulation also stands out. In a real-world session with a vocalist who prefers a warm, vintage sound, I engaged the classic analog emulation and instantly heard the difference. There was a subtle harmonic coloration that made the voice sit more naturally in the mix, without having to add an external analog processor. What's more, the preamps can be toggled per channel, so you can treat each source differently, a flexibility that's often only available on larger consoles. There are, however, a few hidden trade-offs that might affect your decision. Because the unit houses a sizable amount of DSP, it can run hot under prolonged heavy load. In a long mixing session with multiple tracks each running their own UAD plugins, you might notice the fans kicking in louder than you'd expect from a typical audio interface. It's not a deal breaker, but it does add a slight background hiss that some very sensitive ears might pick up while monitoring at low volumes. Also, the software integration with the UAD plugin library requires a stable internet connection for activation and occasional updates. If you're working in a location with spotty Wi-Fi, you might find yourself waiting for a license check before you can actually use a plugin. Another practical consideration: the device's I/O layout is designed for large setups. You have 16 analog inputs, which include a combination of line, instrument, and MIC level connectors, plus multiple clocking.